Every now and again, someone asks me how you would achieve in GameMaker something like the world-wrapping visual style of games such as Animal Crossing. And if you've never seen Animal Crossing, basically the world takes place on a cylinder of sorts. The world will curve away from the camera in the distance, sort of like what you see on screen right now. I'll show footage of the actual game on screen now. And for certain types of games, certain types of camera perspectives in particular, it does have some benefits. Wrapping the world like this allows you to see a little bit more of the sky than you ordinarily would if you just had a flat top-down camera, because the boundary of the world would just extend off the top of the screen in games like that, whereas something like this allows you to actually see more of the sky because the world will curve away from the top of the screen. Having the world curve away from you at a distance can also give a bit of an increased sense of scale to your game world, since this sort of cylindrical wrapping can make the horizon a little bit more prominent on the screen, and you can see objects disappearing over it and that sort of thing. It can, if done properly, also just give the player a little bit more of a sense of like, oh look, what's that off in the distance? Which can be a benefit to certain types of games. And it's also just interesting. Now, this isn't too difficult to do. There's a couple of GameMaker games that have already done it. Beastieball comes to mind. There's one whose name escapes me that does the rounds on Twitter every once in a while, which 3D game in GameMaker that makes use of the style. And there's also a game which someone recently asked me to help out on, which does something like this, which I will be, I'm sure, doing some gameplay of whenever that's officially out. Anyway, enough of this. So I'm going to go over to my one of my GameMaker test projects. So this is I'm going to use my 3D diorama project as a starting point for this. So this is the diorama style is what I like to call games that look like Paper Mario or DS Pokemon games or that sort of thing. This is basically what I'm doing in Wizard Ducks. You have just flat sprites that are standing up perpendicular to the ground. Not billboarded, but everything looks like it's a cardboard cutout of sorts. And there's no world wrapping here, so everything is being drawn just flat. Straight lines are straight, the world doesn't curve away from you. I made a video on doing this back about 1.5 years ago. I'll have it linked if you want to learn more. Stuff you'll want to know going into this. So Animal Crossing World Wrap is simultaneously easier than a lot of people expect it to be, but it's also still definitely not an entry-level GameMaker 3D thing. I'm going to be using my diorama 3D project as the example that we used to get started. And you definitely don't have to be using a setup like that to make this work, but you're probably going to at least want to be on a level where you can understand why the diorama effect works if you want to be able to make this work. You're going to want to know what the world view and projection matrix transformations do, why they work, what the different coordinate spaces are, and we are going to be wrapping things around curves, which means math, and this is far from the most advanced 3D math that we've ever done on this channel, but we're going to be talking about circles and angles and arc lengths and radians and that sort of thing, so I would definitely say that your life will be made markedly easier by remembering your high school trigonometry. Which is a generally true statement in games, but especially for what we're doing today. So, let's see. I have made a few small changes to the diorama project that I'm going to start with. First, I've just added a little uniform to disable or enable the diorama stuff because I also want the code that I'm going to write to be able to be applied to flat things such as the floor, the tile map. And I don't really want the diorama effect to be applied to the tile map for hopefully obvious reasons. And I've also gone and moved around some code in the camera's draw event, so instead of setting up the camera matrices in draw begin or whatever it was, and then the only thing that was happening in the actual draw event was basically this. I moved the camera code around so that the camera's matrices are set in the beginning of the regular draw event. We're going to set the shader. We're going to draw the tile net manually. Instead of having it be drawn by GameMaker automatically, we're going to draw the tile net manually, and then we're going to draw all the diorama objects. You don't have to do any of this. You can use different shaders for the diorama objects in the ground and whatever else in your game. You can totally let GameMaker draw the tile maps for you, but I just want to have less clutter when I'm explaining what's going on here. So before I start writing any code, I'm just going to explain how this is going to work for a minute. So, alright. I'm going to have to do this quick because my camera's battery is running low and I'm too lazy to plug in my drawing tablet today. So, let's start with a rather abstract representation of like a 3D scene or something, right? So let's say this is the ground. It's a flat plane. It's not curving anywhere. And on the ground, you have some diorama objects, perhaps. So a plane, a sprite representing the character. Maybe you have a somewhat bigger one for like trees or something like that in the background, or smaller ones for like flowers or whatever. And you can even have like, I'm just going to draw a circle for maybe a 3D object, some 3D geometry for like a house or a boulder or some other 3D shape. Fancy trees. And another important component of a 3D scene is going to be the camera which you're looking at it through. So I'm going to draw, let's say, a crude approximation of the viewing frustum that the camera is going to see the world through. So this is going to be like our near plane over here, our far plane over here. Can I draw an actual like video camera thing? How do you draw a video camera thing? I'm looking like right at one and I still don't know what it looks like. Does anybody actually use reels of film anymore? Very rarely, but like I'm gonna draw them in there anyway. Where were we? So this is a flat plane and it doesn't curve away from the camera at a distance or anything like that. But if we did want the world to curve away from the camera, how would we represent that? So there's a couple of ways you can do this. There's a couple different like mathematical models of curves that you can use to do this. I'm going to just make it an actual like circle, as if the world is projected onto a cylinder, and the cylinder rolls, and we can just use some nice, convenient, easy like equations for circles to figure out where things are going to end up. You could do this with a parabola or some other shape if you want, but I'm not going to. That would require that like I actually do math. So I'm going to just for the sake of argument, have the basically the top of the cylinder be underneath the player's feet, so that we're like our camera is looking at the player. And if we have a circle that curves away from the player, from the like the plane of the ground, and reaches a tangent to the plane of the ground at the player's feet, we can also continue in the other direction. It's going to look something like that. That's a terrible circle, and it's going to have some radius. It's going to have an origin point some distance below the ground, below the player's feet. This is going to be the radius. And because it's a circle, and because I didn't draw the circle very well, I'm just going to make sure that everybody knows that like the radius to all points on the circle is actually the same, and this isn't some weird mutant shape that popped out of a geometry book or something. And of course, once we have the circle and we know like where we want, like how we want the world wrap to look, like in the abstract, we can start thinking about where we're going to want our objects that were on the flat ground to end up. So obviously, perhaps the the player in our case is going to be where they were originally, because we're having the center of the circle directly below the player's feet. Objects that are slightly behind the player are going to be tilted downward just a little bit. And I'm going to fill those in with this purple marker just because it's a little bit easier to see. And objects that are farther away are going to be tilted a little more around the over the curvature of the circle. And objects that are like this boulder or whatever that was, the circle 3D object that was all the way off the distance, is going to end up maybe something more like that, much farther away. And we need to figure out how to transform each of these objects in the world, each of these vertices in the world, so that they're like wrapped around the surface instead of just being on a flat plane. And the amount of wrapping is going to be the distance away from the camera. I wish I had another marker color because I already used blue. Anyway, the key thing we need to figure out is how exactly we do this repositioning. The fact that this is a circle makes our lives a little bit easier because the distance an object is behind the player, so behind the like the origin point of the circle, is going to be just like the player's, rather the distance of the arc of the circle where it's going to end up. So this boulder, I'm gonna say it's approximately gonna, like, its origin is there, right? So this that's the distance behind the player. This is it would also work for objects in front of the player curving around the other direction, but because this drawing is already getting a little bit complicated, I'm not gonna do that. And we're going to want a section of the arc which is of the same length of that distance. And Again, that wasn't a perfect drawing. It should probably be a little bit longer than that, just eyeballing it. Anyway, once we have that length of the arc, we can take the angle of that arc, the angle that you would get if you like swept the circle from like the origin point here, the vertical in this case, to the distance of this arc here. And then all you really have to do is rotate the coordinates of each of the vertices in the object around the origin point of the circle by that angle. This mark is too thick. That doesn't look like a theta. All right. I think I'm done with the drawings for now, which is good because my camera battery is really about to die. So returning to GameMaker, I'm going to start in the vertex shader of the diorama shader that's being used to draw basically everything in the 3D world. I should make a note about coordinate systems, by the way. So in this example, like we're thinking about our game in terms of like a top-down perspective on the room editor, except it's not quite top-down. It's like a 45-degree angle or a 30-degree angle or something like that. And like X, Y are like to the right and like behind us, and Z is going up in the air. If you're using some other coordinate system, or if your game is using some different kind of perspective, you may need to fiddle around with the coordinates, the X, Y, Z axes, which I'm going to show you here. But I'm gonna guess that most people who are going to try to accomplish this are going to be using a similar camera projection as to what I'm using, so that probably won't be too much of a concern. I'm also going to be doing this transformation in world space.
Hey.
If you would rather do it in view space for whatever reason, you can also do that, but again, the exact values that you need to use will be somewhat different. So this is the diorama code. It's not much. It can be turned on or off with this uniform. In this example, you can ignore it if you don't want to have to think about it. I'm just going to go down below that. So we're going to take the object space position and manipulate it somewhat. The first thing that I think I'm going to need is going to be a uniform vector, and I'm going to call it U_curve origin. And this is going to be a vector 3, which is going to live somewhere down below the player's feet. And that's going to be the center of our circle, because we need that to figure out how things should curve around it. That's going to be a uniform which is going to be set in the camera's draw event after I set the diorama shader and before I actually draw anything. And what did I use in my example project? Alright. Anyway, let's grab the shader uniform, U_curve origin. And that is what I called it, right? U_curve origin. We're going to just get that uniform ID from the shader, and then we can, when we've got that, we can shader set uniform float. This is going to be a vector 3, so it's going to have 3 values. A spot directly below the player's feet would be something like x2, y2, z2 of the camera looking point is going to be basically the player's feet. So the coordinate where the circle is going to originate can be x2, y2, and then z2 minus, let's give it an arbitrary distance of like 1,000 units below the player's feet. This 1,000 value is effectively going to be the radius of the curve, so if you'd like curve radius equals 1,000, and then you can use that instead. Anyway, now we're passing the uniform to the shader. It's not going to affect anything because we're not actually using anything. We're not actually using it for anything, so this all looks exactly the same as it did. Now for the fun part. Now we can actually start going into the shader and using this value. So, the amount of curvature is going to depend entirely on the distance that the vertex is behind, in our case, the player, or more generally, behind on the y-axis, on the like forward and backward axis, away from the curve origin. And we can figure that out by saying float distance behind is going to be u_curve origin.y minus object space position.y. Technically, the curve origin uniform doesn't need to be a vector 3 because we're not actually going to use the x-axis, but if you try to like think about a vector 2 which represents y and z instead of a vector 3 which represents x, y, and z, it's gonna be a lot more confusing than is necessary. So I'm just gonna make this a vector 3 and ignore the x component. Where were we? So the radius of the curve or maybe I should instead say the distance between the vertex that we're drawing, so object space position, and the center of the curve, that is going to be the radius of a circle. And it's not necessarily going to be a circle with the radius that we defined here, because we do want like objects which are in the air or vertices that are not vertices that are not flat on the ground. We still want them to curve away without distortion. So I'm going to need to say float radius is going to be object space position dot z minus the curve origin dot z. So do keep in mind this first value is going to be curve origin dot y minus object space dot y, and the second one is going to be the operands are going to be the other way around, so object space dot z minus curve origin dot z. Basically, stuff that's in the air when we do this world curving operation, we're going to want, like, if they're high up off the ground, we're going to want them to sit on like a concentric circle, a larger concentric circle that has the same origin of the circle that we're like imagining that the ground is. And if an object is like buried underneath the ground, we're going to want it to be curved around a smaller concentric circle.
Hey.
All right, so figuring out the arc is going to be kind of fun, and just a small spoiler: we are going to be using radians for this because in shaders the sine and cosine functions work in radians. And in everyday life, you're probably used to dealing with degrees when it comes to dealing with angles on circles and that sort of thing. But radians have some useful properties that make them somewhat convenient to work with. You'll see what I mean when we get there. So figuring out the arc, the angle of the arc, is going to be an interesting task. So I'm going to start by coming up with a number between like 0 and 1, where 0 is like no arc length and 1 is like all the way around the circle. Basically like 360 degrees divided by 360. It's like a normalized percent. And to do that, we're going to take the distance behind and we're going to divide that by the circumference of the circle. And if I say float circumference, I have no idea if I spelled that right. The circumference is going to be the radius of the circle times pi times pi times 2. So times 3.14159 times 2.0. And then we can say float normalized arc is going to be distance behind divided by the circumference. So again, halfway around the circle will be like 0.5, all the way around the circle will be 1.0, like a third the way around the circle will be 0.333. And we're going to convert that 0 to 1 range to radians, which of course goes 0 to 2 pi. And we can say float arc in radians is going to be the normalized arc multiplied by, again, 3.14159 times 2.0. So if you're paying attention, you might notice that there's a couple of values here which might cancel each other out. So if I just like remove that normalized arc line because it's ugly and stupid and I don't like looking at it, and just do this whole thing in line, and then if I were to take the like the circumference calculation because it's ugly and stupid and I don't like looking at it, and write that in line as well, you might notice that we've got a couple of terms here that you can just kind of factor out. So we're taking a distance, we're taking this number, and we're dividing it by the product of radians times 2 pi, and then we're taking the result of that and multiplying it by 2 pi. And that means that these terms here, these two pi's will cancel each other out, and all that you're going to be left with is going to be the distance behind the cylinder divided by the radius, and that's going to give us the result of the arc in radians. And that's one of the wonderful properties of radians. This wouldn't work if we were working in degrees. We'd be left with something like 180 divided by 3.14159 or something like that. And that's not quite as elegant as working in radians and just saying the angle of the arc is going to be, you know, this very simple division. Anyway, this is the angle that we can use to wrap the each vertex around the origin of the circle, and we can do that by saying object space position dot y is going to equal U curve origin.y plus radius multiplied by the cosine of the arc. You know, I'm just going to call that variable arc because I like short variable names, and I never write them. Hello? And that comes to be a problem in like every single one of these GameMaker videos. Anyway, so that's going to be object space position.y equals curve origin.y plus the radius times the cosine. Object space position.z is going to be the curve origin.z plus the radius times the sine. If you are a fan of the functions length dir x and y in GML, that's basically all that these expressions are, except we're not actually negating the sign here because we'll want that to stay positive. And there's one more little correction that I'll need to do, because if I run this as it is, you probably won't like actually see much, because I'm actually going to want to add 3.14159 divided by 2 to this term. And that's because the angle that we want to use for these calculations is actually going to be the it's going to be 90 degrees or half pi in radians around the circle. At least in the way that my camera is set up. For this pair of calculations, a quarter way around the circle would actually be, to us, like an arc length of 0, so like right directly below the player's feet. It's probably possible to math it out some other way, but I'm lazy and I'm perfectly willing to just add half pi a quarter of the way around the circle to the arc length. Anyway, now if I run this, with those few lines of code, we can see that we have ourselves a world wrap, or an Animal Crossing effect, or whatever you want to call it. The Animal Crossing cylinder, I think, is what I often call it, because it sounds cool when you say it that way. Alright, so if I run far enough, I will run up against the edge of the like the tile map, and it'll like start curving off in the other direction, and we won't be able to see it. If I keep running in this direction, and I'm gonna hold out, alright, your sprite origin is not consistent with the walking sprite, but if I hold down the run button and start running this way, and if I keep going long enough, you might have noticed that there are no constraints on like any of the distances when we did this calculation, and you might remember one of the fun properties of a circle is that if you keep going in a certain direction for long enough, you'll end up back where you started, and that will show us some entertaining effects when we run a certain distance away from the world origin. Once we get to about 1,000 times 2 pi units in world space away from the world origin, we're going to start to see something that we did not put in the room editor, and that is going to be that we sort of ran all the way around the world and came back. This is only the like the ground tile map, because GameMaker's like default sprite calling will prevent sprites from being drawn if they're more than a certain way away from the camera, and then like if they're not drawn in the first place, they won't ever go into this cylindrical like curvature system. We can actually get around that by going into like camera create event and saying, what is it? Sprite call? GPU set sprite call, and just set that to false. And that's going to have sprites always be drawn, even if they're like way far away from the camera. And now if we do that, when the world curves all the way back around itself, 6,280 or so units of world space, we're going to start seeing sprites appearing again. They're not going to look great, because we're going to start running into some like precision and perspective issues when we have the sprites off coming around the world again. But that's like, yeah, okay. If you imagine, like, I don't know, if you're having the world falling into like a black hole or something like that, and you have the tidal forces sort of like ripping sprites apart like this, you might expect to see something like this. But I think that's not what we're going for. It's probably a good idea to go back into the shader and say like arc equals shaders don't have clamp, do they? Oh, they do have clamp. All right, so we can say like we can clamp the arc between like negative radius and positive radius, something like that, and that will just prevent the objects from wrapping all the way around the cylinder and coming back out the other side, which is generally not something that you want. And do I feel like running this way for 6,000 something world space units? I'm not sure if I do. Especially since the intended outcome is for nothing to happen when I when I reach a certain distance. I don't really know where I am. I don't remember what the duck's run speed is in this example. But if I just stand here and, you know, stream of consciousness for long enough, we should start to be convinced that nothing is going to start coming around the other side, right? I think that's enough of that. Let's see. So that's one problem taken care of. Another is that, did I say that we were going to work in world space earlier? We're working in object space now, so this is before the world matrix has been applied to anything. So if you have any objects that are being drawn with the world matrix, this is going to, like, not distort them correctly. I wanted to start with this because I wouldn't have to, like, separate this into a bunch of different, coordinate spaces, but because I think most people are going to have some use of using the world matrix in their game, and they're not just going to solely be drawing their world with like sprites and tile maps, it's probably a good idea to go and let's say vec4 world space is going to be gm matrices matrix world multiplied by objects space position. And then instead of using the object space position when we do this this wrapping effect here, we can use the world space position, and then we would have to get our final like GL underscore position in screen space. We would have to multiply the world space by matrix view projection, except the matrix view projection is not one of the ones applied to the shader by GameMaker, so we're going to have to instead like work that out ourselves. Vec for view space is going to be GM matrices matrix view multiplied by the world space position, and then the screen space is going to be the projection matrix multiplied by the view space. And if I got those all in the right order, this should look the same as it did before, but this calculation is now being done in world space instead of object space, which should handle some, you know, handle some things that I didn't account for in this demo. What else is there? So I mentioned that you could also do this in view space if you want. I'm not going to do that here, but you can imagine how that would work. You would do the transformation into view space, and then you would do, you know, all this in view space instead of in world space. But I'm not going to do that. All right. What else is there? So that's going to be our shader. And I did put this on source control, so I guess I will commit this now. There is one big asterisk that I'd like to add. Well, actually two. One of which I'm not going to show here. So I'm not doing anything with vertex normals in this shader, but if you did do something with vertex normals, you would want to transform those as well. Or honestly, maybe you don't. I don't know. It depends on how you want your lighting to interact with the world wrap effect. Anyway, keep that in mind if you're doing anything with lighting and vertex normals or anything like that. The second thing that you're going to want to keep in mind is that this works in this demo because all of the all the objects that are being drawn have vertices that are, you know, not tremendously far apart from each other. The sprites in this game are going to be 2 triangles, 6 vertices, and they're small enough that any warping or perspective effects don't start to get a little weird unless like that you wrap the world all the way around the cylinder and it comes back around the other side like you saw earlier. The tile map itself is composed of many triangles, which are 1 tile in size and basically drawn the same way that sprites are. However, if instead of drawing a tile map, which is composed of a bunch of like individual tiles, which are themselves composed of a bunch of fairly small triangles, if you were to draw like the ground in a single solid sheet, this wouldn't behave. If I were to do something like draw vertex, is it draw primitive begin? Draw primitive begin, PR triangle strip. And if I were to draw just like 2 massive triangles that cover the entire ground, this wouldn't really behave correctly with it because this wrapping shader works on vertices and not on like a continuous surface. Alright, this shader vertex attributes position, color, and texture coordinates. So if I were to just like hack something together, drawing a triangle strip primitive. Actually, you know what? triangle fan. That way I only need 4 vertices and not 6. Draw vertex, texture color. X can be 0, 0. U is 0, V is 0. Not going to worry about UV mapping or anything right now. The color, let's make the color like C underscore green. And the alpha can be 1. Second one is going to be room width and 0. The third one is going to be room width, room height. And the fourth one is going to be 0 and room height. And that's going to give us a little triangle fan. If I were to disable the world wrap effect, just by commenting all this out, we're going to have a, okay, so it's actually not green, it's white. Did I not? Oh, we're not using vertex color, are we? All right, who cares? So it's going to be a white surface, right? And then if I were to uncomment this, the ground would just disappear because, or it might not disappear completely, but it certainly will be drawn like incorrectly because again, we are going to be transforming the 4 vertices of this, the 4 corners of the ground on their own. And if I were to like run all the way up here, we can see that like we've kind of got the ground being drawn. We can see that like if I run out to the side, basically the floor is being drawn as like, what's a line between 2 different points on a surface? Chord, like a chord between the two points on the surface, because again, we are just transforming vertices to their respective positions. We are not acting on the surface as a continuous shape. Time lapse get around this because they're not one single quad with 4 points. They're like a bunch of individual quads, a bunch of individual tiles with 4 points. And if you were to do flat lighting on this, you would start to notice a little bit of like faceting on the tile map. Where each of the individual vertices are transformed, but since the tile map is a much finer approximation, it's much harder to notice that sort of approximation happening. And I think that's all I really wanted to say about this. How long has this recording been going for? This recording has been going for an hour, but I did have to run off for like 10 minutes to set up the like overhead camera thing from earlier, so hopefully I'll be able to get this video down below around a half an hour. Anyway, that's the Animal Crossing World Cylinder. I'm gonna end this off here. My name is Michael. I like wizards and dragons and making games. If you want the code for this, look for the GitHub repository down in the description of the video. I think this effect is cool. We didn't have to write a lot of code for it, but we did have to think about a fair amount of math to make it work, and bust out the graph paper and whatnot. Let me know if this is something you plan on using in one of your games. Also, let me know if you make any modifications to this behavior so that it distorts in different ways. Maybe you do want a parabola instead of a circle for the distortion. Anyway, you should all go check out Wizard X and the Lost Hat, which is one of the games that I like to work on when I'm not doing YouTube stuff. Link to the Steam page can be found down below. I like to post videos on weird stuff you can do in GameMaker, so if anything like this appeals to you, feel free to subscribe. I have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute to the channel, links to that can be found in all the usual places. I hope you all found this useful, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Zenjamin, Squarecrow, Spy Games, Manta Ray, Ganymede Ghosts, GameMaker, Edward Holt, and DJ Gibbles for supporting these videos. If you'd like to join their ranks, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.